Now, as it currently stands, there are 20 cars that start a Formula 1 Grand Prix each race, assuming that nothing goes wrong, like the engine blows up on the way to the grid, or they crash on the way to the grid, or anything along those lines. And with the constant whisperings that Michael Andretti is looking to bring in a team very, very soon, that will then bring the grid up to 22. But the actual number that can start a Grand Prix, or the maximum number that can start a Grand Prix, is 26. And this is a rule that, as far as I can tell, dates back to at least the 1970s, back when Formula 1 was a much more cost-effective sport, where even teams on smaller budgets compared to the likes of Lotus, Ferrari and McLaren could turn up and race. They might not be competitive, but they'd at least be able to turn up and its drivers would forever be able to say, I started a Formula 1 Grand Prix. But 26 cars doesn't necessarily mean a limit of 13 teams. There have been more in the past. A lot more. And various systems were put in place to make sure that only those that should start the Grand Prix start the Grand Prix. In pre-war Grand Prix racing, sometimes the grid could have been decided purely on a lottery, and I've joked a few times amongst some friends that this would be a great way to decide the grid, particularly at Monaco, as it means the faster drivers would make their way to the front and the slower ones would fall back, and obviously at Monaco it would be a lot harder to get to the front. And if you're in a championship winning scenario near the end of the season, it's a mix of yeet it or take your time, but really, this only works in spec series or series that are heavily regulated in terms of the overall car performance, like the BTCC or the Junior Formula categories. But when the World Championship started in 1950, it became a case of the fastest car and driver combo starting on pole position, and the grid would be decided by who could put in the fastest times. Now, for the first ever Formula 1 World Championship race at Silverstone, qualifying was a little more complicated than what we know today. In fact, from reading online, I don't think they use the same qualifying system at every race. So for the British Grand Prix, the first ever Formula 1 World Championship race in 1950, it was the more simple of the two systems that I'm going to describe for you now. It was basically one session on a Friday, one session on a Saturday, and your fastest time determined your starting position. And the first person to ever score a Formula 1 pole position was Nino Farina, a 150.8, and he went on to win the World Championship that year. Now, where does the term pole position come from? Well, it's a term borrowed from horse racing. In that sport, the fastest qualifying horse starts on the inside of the track, closest to the pole. This is why, up to a point, and some tracks such as Bathurst still do, have pole position on the inside of the track closest to the pit wall to keep that tradition. Suzuka is another notable example, with the traditional inside of Turn 1 being a point of contention prior to the start of the 1990 Japanese Grand Prix. A grid slot that had, contrary to the belief of some, had been there since they started racing at that circuit in 1987. Now today, pole will typically be found on the outside of Turn 1 on the so-called clean side of the track, and some other tracks such as Brands Hatch also have pole on the inside of Turn 1, but since the racing line pretty much drives over that anyway, it's more of an anomaly. But for the 1950 Monaco Grand Prix, it got a little bit more complicated. For this race, there were still two qualifying sessions, one on the Thursday and one on the Saturday. In the Thursday session, the first two rows, so positions 1 through to 5, were decided. And that is the correct maths here, because in those days the grid wasn't 1 by 1, it was 3-2-3 or variations thereof, as the cars were much, much smaller. So the 5 fastest times on that Thursday afternoon were locked in, and the rest of the grid was decided on Saturday. So it was all a bit messed up, as Luigi Villarisi had set a time on Saturday good enough for second, but because Fangio, Farina, Gonzalez, Itansalan and Fagioli had already been locked in from Thursday, he had to start in 6th. For the next race in Switzerland, the Indy 500 excluded because that was in between Monaco and Switzerland, it appears that they went back to that 2-session qualifying system that they'd used originally at Silverstone, and it would remain that way for the next 54 years. Now, this system had its advantages and its disadvantages. For one, if you crashed on the Friday or had mechanical issues on the Friday, there was time to have your car fixed for the second session on Saturday. However, weather could play a factor. It could be perfect conditions on the Friday, but the inverse on the Saturday, meaning nobody would bother going out on the Saturday as there was no way of getting a faster lap. But then the amount of entries for Grand Prix started to increase, and the FIA started to take measures to make sure everything was conducted safely. But by the mid-1970s, safe for the FIA meant, did you die though? No? Okay, we don't need to do anything. But they started to take measures to cap the amount of cars that could start a race. By 1975, it had been capped at 24. it wasn't until 1982 that they capped it to 26. Now, pre-qualifying had been used on a couple of occasions already during the 1970s and into the 1980s, but it wasn't until 1988 that it was a formal procedure. In those other sessions, it was just, if you finished outside of the top 26, you didn't race, similar to how it is in the Indy 500. If you're outside the top 33, you don't race. But now, it was a session in itself, because the sport was now at the point, at least in 1988, that 31 cars were turning up to a Grand Prix on the regular, while at these other races during the 70s and 80s, it was a one-off turn-up for some privateer wanting to race at its home Grand Prix. Now, this is something that is often mentioned when I talk about those classic overly ambitious Italian privateer teams from the 80s, and it was, in a way, good for these crap teams going through the embarrassment of this session because it meant they get some TV time, and what few sponsors they had, or Ponzi schemes in the case of Onyx, got the exposure they needed. The system is pretty easy to work out. The teams with the worst record over the previous 6 months and any new teams would have to go into this Friday afternoon session, and I've picked an example out from the 1988 Brazilian Grand Prix so you've got a visual representation. So you've got 5 cars here: De Cesaris, Modena, Larari, Tarquini and Caffi. So this is essentially the 27th fastest car downwards. So 31 cars would be attempting to enter this race where only 26 can start. Now, Alex Caffi has finished 5th here, so he does not pre-qualify. What this system does is it whittles down 31 drivers to 30. Those 30 go into the qualifying session proper, where 30 is then shrunk down to 26. But then in 1989, it got even worse, with something in the region of 39 cars trying to enter a Grand Prix. In the 1989 Brazilian Grand Prix, there were 13 cars in the pre-qualifying session. I think 1989 is the biggest entry list in F1 history, as far as I can see. Now, pre-qualifying was abandoned during the 1992 season. The Brabham team folded mid-season, and the Andrea Moda team was kicked out for bringing the sport into disrepute, mostly due to Andrea Sassetti's fiscal irresponsibility, we shall call it. But that doesn't mean that every car that entered was starting the race. In 1994, Simtech and Pacific arrived, leaving the amount of entries at 28, meaning 2 cars would miss out for every race. But Pacific folded after just 5 races in 1995. With the grid now at 26 at that point and the likes of Simtech and now 40 bringing up the rear, it meant that all those teams had to do was show up and set a lap. It didn't matter how slow they were, and this is where the rule that made every back of grid team pucker up its arsehole came into effect. The 107% rule. It was now you had to earn your spot on the grid. If you were more than 107% off pole position, you won't start the race. But the FIA does make concessions in extenuating circumstances, such as when Pedro Diniz was allowed to start the 1997 Australian Grand Prix when Villeneuve was so far ahead of the pack. And there's also concessions to take in if it rains midway through the session and if a team has been caught out through that. In that case, they'll just look at the practice times and go, yeah, you're fine. Another reason this rule was brought in was due to the amount of pay drivers that were coming and going from these back-of-grid teams as they found any way they possibly could to survive. One of these drivers was Jean-Denis Delatraz, who was lapped an unbelievable 7 times during the 1995 European Grand Prix, and as a result, the 107% rule was called the Delatraz rule, jokingly in reference to the fact that he was just awful. The qualifying system had a complete overhaul that following year for 1996. Gone was unlimited laps under 2 sessions, and now they had a 12-lap limit, which equates to 4 flying laps, assuming every car did an out-flyer-in system, as the out-laps and the in-laps count to that tally. The system was popular to start with, but then the spectacle of it started to wear off. There would be long periods of nothing happening, and the top teams would go out right at the end and YOLO it once the mid-grid and tail-end teams had laid down some rubber for them. So in 2003 they said, "Okay Michael, you want to YOLO it right at the end? Well now you can YOLO it every week." This new system worked by sending the drivers out on Friday in championship order. So first went out first, second went out second, and so on and so on and so on, and they'd get 1 lap to set their best time. Then on the Saturday, they'd do the same again, but using the results from that qualifying session on the Friday. So if Schumacher was fastest on Friday, he'd go out first, effectively disadvantaging him as he'd be on the track at its dirtiest, while the Minardis would be on the track at its fastest. Theoretically speaking. But then they changed it for 2004. They dropped that Friday session and instead just had the Saturday session, reversing the previous race's race results. So the winner went out first, and then the person that came last in the standings due to retirements or whatever went out last and theoretically had the better track conditions. And they did this to prevent sandbagging, because what Schumacher had done at the 2003 British Grand Prix is he deliberately fluffed his flying lap on the Friday to get a favourable position on the Saturday because of the way the weather forecast was going. So moving on into 2005, they tried an aggregate system, going back to a 2-session format whereby you ran on the Saturday afternoon on low fuel to go as fast as you can, and then you did the same thing on your race fuel on the Sunday morning, with the aggregate times over the 2 sessions dictating who started where. The teams hated it, the drivers hated it, and the fans hated it, and it was dropped in favour of a 1-session format similar to the year before. But in 2006, that's when we get the format that we know today. In the first session, a set number of drivers are eliminated. In the second session, the next block of drivers are eliminated, and then in the final session, the top 10 and pole position are decided. And this system was designed in such a way that it meant that there was always something going on, and there was that edge of seat moment as the faster drivers battled for pole and the other drivers fought to stay in the qualifying sessions. But it wasn't without its flaws. Originally, the cars had to do the third session on race fuel, which resulted in slower lap times. But when refueling was banned in 2010, it meant the cars could run on fumes and bang in that YOLO lap when it counted. But that didn't stop the FIA trying to tweak it though. 2016 happened, and everybody hated it. The system we have now is probably the best system, because unlike the 12-lap system of the late 90s, there's always something going on. So then, an in-depth look of the history of the Formula 1 qualifying regulations. If it's been something new for you and you've learned something new here today, then do give the video a like. If not already, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on any future content. Massive thanks to the kind folk of Patreon for their continued support, and if you want to help support me at a more personal level so I can buy up images and stuff, then you can join the people on your screen by clicking the link in the description, where there'll also be links to Discord and also to my socials. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind. Have a cracking day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.